Hi, I'm Elmarie Wood, and we're going to continue our reading of The Pale Lady by Alexandre Dumas. We are on chapter 2, The Castle of Braunkoven. So let's get started. Then Kostaki let me slip out of his arms onto the ground, and in another moment got down beside me, but quick as he had not been quick enough to anticipate Gregoriska. As the latter had said, within the castle, he was the undisputed master. Seeing the arrival of the two young chiefs and the strange woman they had brought along with them, the servants ran eagerly forward. But though their attentions were divided between Kostaki and Gregoriska, it was plain the greatest obsequiousness, the deepest respect were reserved for the last named. The two women approached. Gregoriska gave them an order in Moldavian and signed me to follow them. The gesture was accompanied by a look expressive of so much respect that I did not hesitate to obey. 5 minutes afterwards, I was in a bedchamber, which, bare and uncomfortable as it must have appeared to the least exacting of mortals, was manifestly the best the castle contained. It was a vast, square apartment, provided with a sort of divan covered with green serge, serving as a seat by day and a bed by night. 5 or 6 great oak settles, an enormous cupboard or wardrobe, and in one corner of the room, a canopied chair resembling a great, richly carved church stall completed the furniture. As to window curtains or bed hangings, such things were out of the question. The way thither was by a staircase adorned with 3 statues, a more than life-sized, of dead and gone Brankovens, standing in niches. In another few minutes, the baggage was brought up, my trunks among the rest. The women offered to help me, but while repairing the disorder produced in my costume by the events of the day, I retained my long riding habit, as better matching my host's personal appointments than any other costume I could have adopted. Scarcely had I completed these little changes of dress when I heard someone knocking softly at the door. "Come in," I said, speaking naturally enough in French. French being, as you are aware, the second mother tongue to us Poles. Gregoriska appeared, saying, "Ah, madame, I am happy to know that you speak French." "And I too, sir," I replied. "I am happy to know that language, since thanks to my doing so, I have been able to appreciate your generous conduct towards me. It was in that tongue you championed me against the evil designs of your brother, and in the same language I now offer you the expression of my heartfelt gratitude." "Thank you, madame. It was no more than natural I should take the side of a woman situated as you were. I was hunting in the mountain when I heard irregular but long-continued firing. I knew it must be a question of some attack by armed violence, and made for the scene of the action. I arrived in the nick of time, thanks be to God. But may, as you ask now, but may I ask you now, madame, by what strange chance a lady of distinction like yourself came to expose herself to the risks of our wild mountains?" "I am a Pole, sir," I replied. "My 2 brothers have just been killed in the war against Russia. My father, whom I felt prepared to defend our castle against the enemy, has doubtless rejoined them by this time. For myself, I was flying to escape from those scenes of massacre and seeking by my father's orders an asylum in the cloister. I'll start that once more. For myself, I was flying to escape from those scenes of massacre and seeking by my father's orders an asylum in the cloister of Sasharatsu, where my mother in her youth and under similar circumstances had found a secure refuge." "You are the foe of the Russians. So much the better," cried the young man. "This will be a strong point in your favor in our castle here, and we shall require all our strength to sustain the struggle that's brewing. And now, as I know now who you are, learn, madame, who we are. The name Braunkoven is unknown to you, is it not, madame?" I bowed assent. "My mother is the last princess of the name, the last descendant of that illustrious chief who was done to death by the Cantemirs, the kite of courts of Peter the First. My mother married her first husband, my father, Serban Wivide, a prince, as she was a princess, but of less illustrious race. My father had been brought up at Vienna, where he had learned to appreciate the advantages of civilization. He resolved to make a European of me. We started on our travels embracing France, Italy, Spain, and Germany. My mother, it's not a son's part, I know, to tell you what I'm going to, but inasmuch as for your own safety, it behooves you to know us intimately. You will understand the necessity for the revelation. My mother, who during the earlier years of my father's absence, when I was still quite a child, had guilty relations with the party chieftain. This added Gregoriska with a laugh. Is what men have wantonly attacked you are entitled in our country. My mother, I saw, who had had guilty relations with a certain Count Giordaki Coproli, half Greek, half Moldavian, wrote to my father confessing all and asking for divorce, declaring in support of her demand that she could not bear, Brankoven as she was, to continue the wife of a man who deliberately, day by day, was making himself more and more a stranger to his native land. Alas, my father was never called upon to agree to the request, one that may seem extraordinary to you, but which with us is looked upon as the simplest and most natural thing in the world. He had just died of an aneurysm, from which he had long suffered, and it was I who received the letter. There was nothing for me to do beyond expressing my heartfelt wishes for my mother's happiness. And this I did in a letter in which I announced to her the news of her widowhood. In the same letter, I begged her permission to continue my travels, and this was readily granted. My fixed resolution had been to settle in France or Germany so as to avoid meeting a man who hated me and for whom I could not possibly feel affection for. That is to say, my mother's second husband. But suddenly one day I received news that Count Giordaki Coproli had been assassinated, by all accounts at the hands of the old Cossack troopers of my father's. I hurried home. I loved my mother and understood her present isolation and her natural craving to have beside her at such a moment such persons as were bound to her by close ties of kinship. True, she had never shown any very tender affection for me, but still she was my mother. One morning, without word to announce my arrival, I entered the castle of my ancestors. There I found a young man whom I took at first as a stranger, but whom I learnt later was my brother. That this was Kostaki, the child of adultery, now legitimized by my mother's second marriage. Kostaki, the untamable being you have yourself seen, whose passions are his only law, who holds nothing sacred in all the world but his mother, who obeys me as the tiger does the man that has mastered him by sheer force. And this is with a never-ceasing growl of protest, in vain hope of one day devouring me. Inside the castle, within the home of the Brankovens and Wavides, I am still master, but once outside its walls, once in the open country, he is again the savage child of the woods and mountains, resolved to make everything bend to his iron will. How come he to yield today? What made his men obey another? I cannot say. Perhaps force of habit, some relic or of tradition perhaps force of habit, some relic of traditional respect. I should not care to put my authority to a second proof. Stay here. Do not quit this room, this court, in a word, the circuit of these walls. And I can guarantee your safety. Take one step outside the castle, and I promise nothing except to sacrifice my life in your defense. Then I cannot continue my journey to the monastery of Sushratsu as my father wished? Try if you will. Command and I shall obey, but the end will be, I shall be left a dead man by the wayside and you will never reach your destination. What is to be done then? Best stay here and await events. Have patience and profit by circumstance. Recognize that you are fallen into the bandit's den and that your courage alone can save you. Your presence of mind alone release you. My mother, despite her preference for Kostaki, the son of her love, is kind and generous. Moreover, she is Braunkoven. In other words, a true princess. You shall be presented to her. She will defend you against the brute passions of Kostaki. Place yourself under her protection. You are fair to look upon, and she will love you. Indeed, he went on, looking at me with an indescribable expression on his face. Who could see you and not love you? Come now to the hall, where supper is prepared and where my mother awaits you. Show neither embarrassment nor distrust and speak Polish. No one understands that tongue here. I will translate your words to my mother, and rest assured, I will only say what should be said. Above all, not a word of what I have just told you, not a breath of our mutual understanding. You do not know yet all the wiles and subterfuges of the most straightforward of countrymen. Now come. I followed him down the staircase I have described, now lighted by pinewood torches burning in iron hands protruding from the walls. Evidently, so unusual an illumination had been made in my honor. Arrived at the great hall, Gregoriska threw open the door and pronounced a Moldavian word, which I learnt subsequently means the stranger. Hereupon, a tall, imposing woman came forward to meet us, the Princess Braunkoven. Her white hair was coiled in plaits around her head, on which rested a little cap of sable, surmounted by an aigreette, sign of her princely origin. She wore a sort of tunic of cloth of gold, covered in pearls, falling over a long skirt of Turkish material, trimmed with the same fur of her headdress. In her hand she carried a rosary with amber beads, which she was turning rapidly between her fingers. Beside her stood Kostaki, wearing the magnificent and imposing Magyar costume, which lent him a still stranger and more exotic look than ever. It consisted of a gown of green velvet and with ample sleeves, falling below the knee, breeches of rich red cashmere, and Turkish slippers of Morocco leather, embroidered in gold. His head was covered, and his long locks, so black as to be almost blue, tumbled about his bare neck, confined merely by the slender white line of the edging of a silken shirt. He gave me an awkward bow and said a few words in Moldavian which I could not understand. You can speak French, brother, Gregoriska said to him. Madame is Polish and understands the language. Upon this, Kostaki made some remarks in French, which were all but as unintelligible to me as those he had uttered in Moldavian. But the princess now extended her hand imperiously and imposed silence on them both. I could plainly see she was telling her sons it was her place to receive me. Then she began in Moldavian a speech of welcome, which the expression of her face made it easy to gather the drift of. She signed me to the table, offering me a seat by her side, embraced the whole house in a sweeping gesture as if to tell me it was all at my disposal. Then sitting down first with kindly dignity, she made the sign of the cross and began a prayer. This ended, all took their places determined by etiquette, Gregoriska's being next below mine. I was a stranger and consequently occupied a place of honor next to Kostaki, who sat beside his mother Smirande. Gregoriska had likewise changed his dress. He now wore a Magyar tunic like his brother, only his was of garnet red and his breeches were of blue cashmere. A magnificent decoration hung at his neck, a nisham of the Sultan Mahmud. The rest of the house supped at the same table, each in the due subordination given him by his physician, among the friends or dependents of the family. The meal was a gloomy one. Not once did Kostaki address me, though his brother took pains to converse with me, and always in French. As for their mother, she offered me some of every dish herself, with the air of grave solemnity which never left her. Gregoriska had said truly she was a veritable princess. After supper, Gregoriska came forward and, approaching his mother, explained to her in Moldavian the desire I must be feeling to be alone, and how needful rest was for me after the emotions of a day such as I had passed. Smarande bowed her head in assent, reached from me her hand, kissed me on the brow as she might have done to a daughter, and wished me a good night and sound repose in her castle. Gregoriska was right. I longed eagerly for a moment's solitude. So I thanked the princess, who led me to the door of the hall, where I found waiting for me the two women who had previously attended me. I made my bow to the mistress of the house, saluted her two sons, and retired to the same apartment, the room I had quitted an hour before to come down to supper. Meantime, the divan had been converted into a bed, and the only change that had been effected. I thanked my tirewomen and informed them by signs that I would undress myself. On this they left the room at once, with marks of respect that showed they had received orders to obey me implicitly. I was left alone in the vast apartment, which my light was insufficient even to illuminate from end to end. I could only make out bits of time as I moved my candle from place to place, never the whole room at once. The light was strangely blended, the moonbeams entering through the curtainless window and struggling to diminish the glimmer of my taper. Besides the door by which I had entered and which opened to the staircase, my room possessed two others, but massive bolts attached to these and fastening from inside sufficed to reassure me on the score. Next, I examined the entrance door. Like the others, it was well provided with means of defense. Then I threw open my window and found a sheer precipice beneath it. I saw plainly enough that Gregoriska had made a deliberate choice of this particular chamber to ensure me against danger. Presently, coming back to my divan, I discerned a little note lying on the table next to my bedside. I opened it and read it in Polish. Sleep at ease. You will have nothing to fear so long as you remain within the castle walls. Gregoriska. I followed the advice given me, and weariness prevailing over all other feelings, I lay down and fell fast asleep. Well, I hope you've enjoyed Chapter 2 of The Pale Lady by Alexandre Dumas. We will reconvene another day to get into Chapter 3.